Why shouldn't you buy a vintage turntable? Or, if you buy or already have a vintage turntable, what are the pitfalls? What's likely to go wrong? I don't mean to disparage vintage turntables. I still use the first good turntable I got in 1984. And I've recently acquired a couple of classics. But I've also worked on several vintage turntables recently, and I ran into some problems that didn't have easy fixes. Therefore, my enthusiasm for vintage turntables has been dampened. Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. I'm Stephen Lancaster. Let's talk about vintage turntables and the problems they may have. A turntable's first job is to turn, silently and easily. Generally, the platter sits on the spindle, which in turn sits in a metal cylinder and on a bearing. Most commonly, the bottom of the spindle is flat steel and sits on a steel ball bearing, and the ball bearing sits on the bottom of the cylinder holding the spindle. Add the right oil, and such a spindle and bearing assembly allows the platter to turn with very little friction and therefore nearly silently. Still, there's some friction. Worse, turntables may be transported, even shipped, without removing the platter, and rough handling, jostling, and vibration can contribute to the inevitable wear on the metal-on-metal contacts. The ball bearing can make indentations in both spindle and cylinder, and those can make flattened spots on the ball bearing. Assemblies with flattened bearings and indented cylinders and spindles mean the platter turns with greater friction and more noise. This problem is not easy to fix unless you can find a replacement assembly, and good luck with that. I mean, you might find one on eBay, but it may have the same problem. If you're shopping for a vintage turntable, you must need to properly inspect your potential purchase, right? Right. I always fully disassemble turntables and inspect the spindles and bearings before I decide to buy. But of course I don't. What should you actually do? I don't know, man. I mean, you can give the platter a spin, or rather a small nudge to see whether it stops right away. If it's a belt drive, take off the belt first. If the belt is old and loose, you'll probably need to take the platter off to get the belt out of the way. With luck, the seller won't be too jumpy and get freaked out while you take their turntable apart. I suppose you could put a stethoscope to the plinth to listen for bad bearings. With either of these tests, it might be difficult to distinguish between bad bearings and those simply needing cleaning and relubrication. Maybe just don't worry about it and have reasonable expectations. Maybe you should never count on an old turntable for the performance you'd expect from a new one. Or find a seller who works on his turntables before selling them and inspects the bearings himself. Ask him, and maybe he'll tell you about the condition of the spindle and bearing. I've been disappointed with the quality of replacement belts. A while back, I restored a Pioneer PL514 for my son. I bought a new belt on Amazon. The new belt was too thick and made the turntable too fast. I bought another belt from LP Gear, and that one got the speed right. Recently, I bought 3 new belts from LP Gear for 3 different turntables, including another PL514. All 3 belts were too thick and made the turntables too fast. One, a dual, had enough adjustability to get the speed right. Well, it was right on average, but it was way too variable. That is, the wow and flutter were out of spec. The dual had a sub-platter, so I took off the main platter and looked closely as the belt turned the sub-platter. The belt had irregularities that caused speed variations. Speed variation was also greater than spec for the other 2 turntables. For the PL514, the new belt from LP Gear was worse than that one I'd gotten from Amazon. I sent a message to LP Gear to let them know that all 3 belts were unacceptable and that I wouldn't order any more belts from them unless they could assure me they'd solved their quality problems. They said they'd replace them and included instructions for proper measurement of required belt length. That was the reply I was expecting, but I was hoping for something more like, OMFG, thank you so much for letting us know. We've put a stop on all orders from our current belt supplier and are looking for a new one. We're giving you a full refund on your last order and offering you a $100 credit as a thank you for alerting us to the problem with our belts. Hey, I can dream, can't I? Of course, I will not order another belt or anything else from LP Gear. I don't know where I should buy new belts now. Origin Live is a promising source, and I've recently learned that a local business, turntableneedles.com, sells belts. But here's the deal with belts. Audiophiles these days generally prefer belt drive turntables because they can more effectively isolate the drive motor from the platter, and therefore the stylus. But getting the speed right depends on the correct belt thickness. If the belt is too thick, it's like shifting to a larger chainring or front gear on your bike, and the platter speed is too fast. If the belt thickness isn't uniform, then the platter speed won't be steady. The motor speed can be perfectly steady, but the platter speed can't be steady if the belt isn't uniform. Automatic and auto-return turntables typically rely on parts molded out of that white nylon plastic. These parts are actually surprisingly durable, but some are used in ways that typically lead to failure. The most common breakage in my experience is cracked cams. On many turntables, including the Pioneer PL630 and Realistic Lab 400, a turning cam initiates various actions like tone arm motion and muting and unmuting the output. The cam is mounted to the D-shaped end of the metal camshaft and fixed in place with a screw that tightens against the metal and threads in the plastic collar. This design is ubiquitous and makes failure inevitable. The plastic eventually cracks. When that happens, the cam no longer moves correctly. If the cam only controls tone arm motion, then you just lose the automatic functions. If the cam actuates a mute switch, as on the Lab 400 and the Dual 1219, then you lose sound. Luckily, cracked cams are usually fixable, for example, by tightening a cable tie around the collar to hold the crack closed. Otherwise, though, cracked nylon can be really difficult to fix, because most glues and epoxies don't bond to nylon. Some people resort to welding cracks, with a soldering iron as the welding torch and a white cable tie as the welding rod. 3D printing new parts is another potential solution. The moving parts in turntables, from speed selector switches to the levers and gears that control automatic functions, and even the shaft that drops the tone arm slowly, but not too slowly, all rely on the proper application of the proper grease to function correctly. Metal levers and plastic gears typically need white lithium grease, which can get gummy or crusty with age. If you ever get an old turntable like a Dual 1219 with a switch that won't move easily, don't force it. The plastic may break before the old grease comes unstuck. If the tone arm drops too quickly or too slowly, the lifter shaft probably needs new silicone grease. The right grease has enough stiction for the shaft to go up and down at the right speed. The fix for bad old grease is cleaning and good new grease. Just use the right grease and don't put grease where it doesn't belong. In a previous video, I was pretty bullish on vintage turntables. Have I changed my mind? Well, I have moderated my position. Of the problems I've described here, the spindle and bearing assembly problem is the one that troubles me most. Various online forums do discuss methods of rebuilding these assemblies and even making them better than new, but these methods sound pretty involved, and I don't know how often they're successful versus not. Bad belts probably cause the biggest, most widespread degradation of sound quality. If you have a belt drive turntable, download the free app, Speed and Wow, and check your turntable. If the speed is fast and or the wow and flutter are too great, you should probably try a new belt. Most belts should be a uniform 25 mils or 0.6 millimeters thick, and the belt should be smooth, even a bit shiny. Don't be afraid to return bad belts. I still think vintage turntables are a good option, but I have to admit that I have little experience with new turntables. My newest turntable is the Gemini TT04 from 2005, and I still didn't buy it new. The turntable I use most is the one I've had since high school, the Pioneer PL630, made in 1979 and that I bought used in 1984. I shipped it badly a few times in the 80s and 90s, so I'd be surprised if it doesn't suffer from a worn spindle assembly. However, I'm still getting a lot of enjoyment from that turntable, and I have no plans to replace it. I do have some idea that I might rewire the tone arm and maybe give it balanced connectors. And enjoyment is really the bottom line with hi-fi. Do what makes you happy while working within your budget. And don't let this video about defects and failures bum you out. But we shouldn't fool ourselves either. My 45-year-old Pioneer will never sound as good as my friend Chris's late model Avid. And that's okay. I wouldn't mind having a turntable like that, but I'm fine with what I've got. I hope you learned something from the video and even enjoyed it. But hell, if you're hate watching my channel for some reason, I'm fine with that too. Just be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment as the spirit moves you. Have you encountered any of the problems I've mentioned? And how have you solved them? Have a great day, and I'll talk to you later.